Israel versus Palestine, the untold story of 60 years of strife. On May 14, 1948 in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion announced the establishment of the State of Israel. Following the United Nations resolution, the founding of the Jewish state in the land of Israel was declared. At last, the Jewish people have their own country. Just 3 years after the fall of Nazism and the slaughter of 6 million Jews, they can now settle in the land of their ancestors. For the Arabs living on the same land in Palestine, this day marks the Nakba, or the disaster. Fleeing from conflict or being expelled by the Zionist army, over 700,000 Arabs are forced to leave the country. Many families believe they are only leaving temporarily. However, these refugees will soon transform into a people living in exile, desperately seeking to return to the land they call Palestine, which others refer to as Israel. War, underground resistance, terrorism, popular uprisings and repression, suicide bombings, reprisals and occasional hopes for peace. For 60 years the battle over this land, claimed by two peoples, has continued relentlessly. A Palestinian teacher turned hijacker, a Cairo student who became a guerrilla leader, a child from Gaza raised in a refugee camp, an Israeli pioneer's son and army reservist, and a young Tel Aviv filmmaker, unexpectedly caught in the heart of the Intifada. Through personal photos and films, this is how 5 very different lives have been shaped by a tragedy with no end in sight. These are the borders of Israel. More than 700,000 Palestinians have fled to neighboring countries, to Lebanon, to Syria, and to 2 remaining Arab-controlled parts of former Palestine, the West Bank, annexed by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip under Egyptian rule. Refugees gather at the borders, they left in haste and they wait, hoping to return home. 18 years later, the refugees are still there. Temporary tents have been replaced by concrete buildings, but the hope of returning to Palestine remains strong. Layla Khalid, a 23-year-old teacher, is a rebel and an admirer of Che Guevara. She writes in her journal, "The Zionists forced us out of our homeland. They live in my city because they are Jewish and powerful, but one day we, the survivors of the desert, will gain power and reclaim Palestine." Layla Khalid once lived on the Mediterranean coast in Haifa's elegant neighborhoods. When Israel was created, her family fled the conflict and sought refuge in Lebanon. Here she is, pictured with her siblings standing in front of their home. She is the youngest, at just 4 years old. This was shortly before they left. The 1960s, Layla Khalid's Palestine had already changed. Israel had become a rapidly developing country, where people lived in a westernized way. A new generation had been born, one that knew neither Nazism nor the Exodus. On the beaches of Tel Aviv and Eilat, life was far removed from the struggles of young Palestinians. Yet in the spring of 1967, Layla Khalid found reason to believe. In Arab capitals, crowds grew feverish with emotion. In Egypt, demonstrators shouted for the death of Jews. President Gamal Abdel Nasser called for the destruction of Israel. He was supported by his Soviet ally, and by the Arab world, which rejected this new neighbor. A war for reconquest seemed inevitable. In the south, Egypt mobilized its troops near the border. In the west, the Jordanian army was on high alert. In the north, Syria prepared for war. Arab radios broadcast warnings to Jews in Hebrew, "Disaster will strike you." Israel was about to take everyone by surprise. At 7:45 a.m. on June 5, 1967, Israeli aircraft took off toward Cairo. Pilots were informed of their mission only at the last moment. Within minutes, the planes reached Egypt. The Israelis struck first. Egypt's air force was destroyed. On the ground, Israeli tanks pushed enemy forces beyond all borders. Among the tanks was Major Yuri Hurwitz of the 45th Brigade. Yuri was the son of an Israeli pioneer, whose father fled Russia at the start of the century to escape anti-Semitic pogroms. With a group of Zionists, he established one of the country's first kibbutzim, Kfar Giladi, near the Lebanese border. They began with tents, then built a farm, another farm, and eventually an entire village on a remote hill. Yuri was born there. He grew up alongside the kibbutz. This land became his entire world. He was proud of what his parents had built. For Yuri, this war was about survival. "We were defending our home. There's nowhere else in the world to go. What would have happened if they had won? They would have exterminated us all. We knew that." But Israeli troops didn't just defend. They seized new territories. In the south, they captured the Sinai Peninsula and a small strip of land called Gaza, home to several Palestinian refugee camps. One of these camps was Rafah. The refugees there lived far from Tel Aviv's modern and Western lifestyle. They existed in another era entirely. There was no running water in their homes, no electricity either. a short distance from the main road. 5.5-year-old Abdul Salam Shahade lived with his brothers and sisters. His father had experienced the 1948 Exodus. He had lived farther north, in a village now under Israeli control. That morning, Abdul Salam was asleep when Israeli tanks rolled into Rafah. I woke up suddenly. There were people everywhere in the streets. We heard the Jews have entered the city. Panic spread. Nobody really understood what was happening. On the main street I saw many dead bodies. For us, everything changed after 67. In Jerusalem too, everything was changing. Israeli forces captured the Arab sector of the Holy City. It was a dream they couldn't achieve in 1948 during the War of Independence. After 2,000 years of exile, Jews regained control of the Temple Mount, Judaism's holiest site. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, recognizable by his eye patch, stood alongside the victorious General Yitzhak Rabin at the foot of the Western Wall. The news spread rapidly. I was in radio contact with my commander, someone I knew in Jerusalem called all the units. He said, "We've captured Jerusalem." I was sitting in my tank at the time, hearing over the radio that they had taken the Western Wall. Stirred something indescribable within me. Even today, I feel emotions I cannot explain. Yitzhak Rabin, the victorious general, became a national hero. In a few years he would even lead the government. His victory was complete. The Israeli soldier is an exceptional soldier. He has the will to triumph. He understands the reason he's fighting. He has the bravery to fight and the training for combat. In a mere 6 days, the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian forces are defeated. These images of the Arab defeat are spreading worldwide. Not only did Israel survive, but the Jewish state expanded its territory fourfold. The soldiers of the Hebrew state planted their flag in Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan. In 1967, the world's perception began to shift. Israel is no longer the tiny Hebrew state besieged, a legacy of the Holocaust. So in Paris, General de Gaulle delivered his controversial statement on the Jewish people, an elite people confident and assertive. The tone has been set. Israel is no longer a victim, it has transformed into a military power. In neighboring nations, the Arab defeat was unexpected. Salah al-Tamari, a Palestinian born in Bethlehem, was studying in Cairo when the war began. He didn't participate in anti-Israel protests because he was focused on studying for exams, but he listened to Egyptian radio, which reported major Arab victories, until he learned the truth. I recall returning from university, and as I reached my building I overheard a neighbor listening to English radio. It was Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan holding a press conference in Jerusalem. It caught my attention. I stopped to listen as he said, "We've arrived, and we don't plan on leaving." I realized then that everything we'd heard on Arabic radio was wrong. The Israelis occupied the West Bank, Sinai, and the Arab nations lost the war. I collapsed on the stairs. I was devastated, completely crushed. Salah al-Tamari now has a realization. To combat Israel, the Palestinians can only depend on themselves, but they lack both an army and a leader. In Jordan, a training camp has been running for some time where the Fatah, a clandestine organization, trains fighters. Its leader is Yasser Arafat. He's an engineer born in Egypt, but his father hails from Gaza and his mother from Jerusalem. Arafat never trusted the Arab countries. He aims to establish an independent Palestinian army. At this point, he's still an unknown figure living in hiding with a few fighters. Everything changes after the Battle of Karameh. Karameh is a refugee camp in Jordan, just a few kilometers from the border. Yasser Arafat makes this his headquarters. From here, the fighters initiate their guerrilla operations against Israel. Among them is Salah al-Tamari, the former Cairo student. At that time, there wasn't a clear command structure. We were a small group. Among us was Arafat. Each day we waited for our turn to cross the border and take part in operations in occupied territory, which I did several times. On March 18, 1968, an Israeli school bus detonates on a mine planted by Fatah. 30 children are killed or wounded. For Israel it's unbearable. The reprisals are massive. A force of 6,500 soldiers is sent to wipe out Karameh and the 300 Fedayeen fighters. Against all odds, the Palestinians hold their ground. Al-Tamari leads the resistance. What's crucial about Karameh is that we, the young fighters, decided to stand and fight. Our goal was not necessarily to destroy the Israeli army, but to prove we were real fighters, willing to die for our country. We knew that each death would be replaced by hundreds, even thousands of volunteers. In fact, that's exactly what happened. After 15 hours of combat, Israeli tanks finally enter Karameh. The Palestinians are decimated, half are killed, the rest are either captured or on the run. For the first time since the Six-Day War, Palestinians resist Israel. Hebrew soldiers are injured, some even killed. The military defeat becomes a psychological victory for the Palestinians. In the Arab world's eyes, the leader of the fighters is now a hero. Yasser Arafat emerges from hiding. He gives his first interviews to the international media. We will establish our own democratic and independent Palestinian state, a state where all citizens, Christians, Jews, Muslims will live equally in fraternity. He takes control of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which unites all the resistance groups. At 40, wearing his dark glasses and keffiyeh, he now symbolizes Palestinian resistance. Meanwhile, Layla Khaled, the young Palestinian teacher, is undergoing training at a military camp. She isn't part of Yasser Arafat's Fatah. She has joined the PFLP, a more radical faction of the guerrilla movement. She waits for her first mission. In 1969, she is finally called. What they ask her is quite extraordinary. My leader asked me, "Are you ready to die?" I replied, "Of course," he said. "That's not the point. Are you ready to go to prison?" "Of course, many of my classmates, my brothers and sisters are in Israeli prisons," he replied. "That's not the point either. Are you ready to hijack a plane?" I laughed. All this terminology was new to me. I laughed and explained that I imagined myself running with a plane on my back and everyone chasing after me. I didn't know what it meant. He asked again, "Are you ready?" I said I was ready for anything. I asked, "Am I going to Palestine?" He answered, "We'll see." August 29, 1969. A TWA flight traveling from Los Angeles to Tel Aviv makes a brief stop in Rome. Layla Khaled boards the flight with a companion. Among the passengers there is supposed to be Yitzhak Rabin, the victorious general of the Six-Day War. Something had to happen to provoke the world into questioning. So who exactly are these Palestinians? It was clear that if we hijacked a plane with a figure like Rabin on board, Israel could not ignore it. They would have to exchange him for prisoners. Unfortunately, Rabin switched planes in Rome. After takeoff, the two hijackers stormed the cockpit. The flight, originally headed for Tel Aviv, is rerouted to Syria. It flies over Israel. For the first time, Layla Khaled sees Haifa again, her childhood city. I instructed the pilot to exit. He left. Israeli fighter jets surrounded us. I broadcast on the radio, "We are the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine." Repeat. The control tower responded, "Popular Front Palestine." I replied, "I don't understand you, say it clearly." He repeated it 3 times in clear terms. To me it felt like a victory. It was the first time we heard someone say "Free an Arab Palestine" in another language. Minutes later, the plane touched down in Syria. Passengers were evacuated. The hijackers destroyed the plane. A bold move aimed at influencing public opinion. Layla Khaled made headlines worldwide, but she wasn't done yet. By hijacking this plane, we intended to show the world there is a war here. That's why we're in the Middle East, to tell them, don't come here. And, do you plan to continue fighting for your cause? Yes. In northern Israel, reservist Yuri Hurwitz is called to leave his kibbutz in Kfar Giladi once more. This time it's not to join his tank. The government has enlisted him to enhance security on airplanes. Yuri imposes new airport security protocols and arms personnel on Israeli El Al flights. These measures will change everything. September 6, 1970, Amsterdam Airport. An El Al flight to New York is set for departure. Among the passengers, no one notices Layla Khaled and her accomplice Patrick Argulo, a South American activist. Despite security measures, they board carrying guns and grenades. Layla went undetected. She had undergone 3 cosmetic surgeries to avoid recognition. What she doesn't realize is that there are armed men aboard. The Israelis began shooting the moment we stood up. People were told to stay calm. I rushed toward the cockpit. Patrick was behind me and shots were being fired everywhere. When the plane landed in London, Patrick Argulo was dead. Layla Khaled was immediately arrested, but not for long. Thousands of kilometers away, 3 more planes were hijacked by pirates from Layla Khaled's group. They landed at an abandoned airport in Zaka, Jordan, now under Palestinian control. It was an unprecedented operation. 400 American, British, and Swiss hostages were taken. The Fedayeen demanded their release in exchange for prisoners, with Layla Khaled included as part of the deal. Our demands are very clear and we won't back down no matter what. These conditions are the release of comrade Layla Khalid, the return of the martyr's body, and their evacuation to a safe place in exchange for British hostages. In Israel, Prime Minister Golda Meir insists on a firm stance. She refuses to let the British release Layla Khalid. What will these people do once they are freed? Is this young woman going to a convent? Will she get married and raise children? Will she return to teaching? She herself says it, she will try again. I don't know which plane it will be this time. After 6 days of negotiations, the hostages are freed. All of them are still in shock from their ordeal. Most had never even heard of Palestine. In return, the hijackers are granted the release of prisoners. Once again, the hijackers destroy the planes in front of cameras around the world. Layla Khalid is extradited to Egypt, where devastating news awaits her. The Egyptians are mourning the death of their president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the man who aimed to destroy Israel in 1967. Layla has lost one of her heroes, but even worse events have unfolded in a neighboring country. The explosion of the planes in Zaka enraged King Hussein of Jordan. For some time now, the king had stopped supporting Palestinians who believed Jordan was their homeland. Their militias control entire neighborhoods in Amman. Some of their leaders even openly call for the king's overthrow. Hussein knows he's in danger. The plane explosions provided the pretext he had been waiting for. On September 17th, he sent his troops into the refugee camps. Thousands died in what Palestinians called Black September. Salah al-Tamari was at the heart of the fighting. It was more painful than Karameh or the Six-Day War. When you fight against the Israelis, you expect anything. They have occupied our land and they are our enemies, but this was Jordan. They are our brothers. We share the same people, the same nation, and the same culture. Sadly, it happened and we paid a high price. A new exodus begins. Palestinian fighters and their families are expelled from Jordan, fleeing towards Lebanon. From there, Yasser Arafat and his forces now aim to lead the fight. The head of the PLO will count on the support of Karameh commander Salah al-Tamari. Together, they head to Beirut. Layla Khalid also goes to Lebanon. She is tasked with training in the camps. These two hijackings made her a star, but the era of hostage-taking operations that end well is over. September 1972, Munich Olympic Games. Something is happening at the Israeli pavilion. On the balcony, hooded men. A Palestinian commando takes the Israeli delegation hostage. It's called Black September, in memory of the Jordanian massacre. It's a global event. Palestinians are now more visible than ever. The operation ends tragically. German police attempt a rescue operation. The hostage-takers execute the 11 athletes before being shot or arrested. Bloody terrorism has only just begun. In this climate, Yarov Horowitz is born in Tel Aviv, Israel. His mother is a pacifist left-wing activist. His father is fairly liberal. Despite hearing about peace and happiness between people at home, the general atmosphere of the country is heavy. As children, we were terrified of Arabs because of the terrorist attacks we saw on TV and read about in the papers. Many violent stories about Arabs circulated. That's how we grew up in fear. In the early 70s, terrorism wasn't the only threat. Little Yarov had other reasons to be afraid. October 6, 1973, it's 2 p.m. when alarm sirens blare in Israel. It's during the Yom Kippur fast, the Jewish holiday of atonement. One of my first memories is of the sirens on Yom Kippur in 73. I was 2 years old. I remember it because of the shock of my mother running with the stroller. I don't know if it's my memory or if she told me about it, but it's somewhere in my recollections. This time it's a new war. Egypt and Syria attack. Arab neighbors aim to reclaim land lost during the Six-Day War. In Gaza, in the Rafah refugee camp, close to the Egyptian border, little Abdul Salam grew up, now 11 years old. He listens to his favorite radio show. The radio started broadcasting national anthems. We knew something unusual was happening. We learned that the Egyptians had invaded Sinai. I remember the mayor telling us to go up to the roof to check whether the bullets were Egyptian or Israeli. The Israelis were caught off guard. 6 years after the Six-Day War's triumph, Israel faces a new threat. Reservist Yuri Hurwitz, the man from the kibbutz, was on an overseas mission. When he heard the news, he rushed to catch the first flight home. When the Yom Kippur War started, I was in Canada. I immediately returned to Israel. There's no other country in the world, no France, Italy, or even the United States, where people come back to fight like this. Young people from everywhere like I did, dropping everything. The Yom Kippur War is not just another conflict between Jews and Arabs, it's a global crisis because the Arab countries now have a new weapon, oil. They refuse to sell their products to those who are allies of Israel. In both America and Europe, gas prices are rising. The oil crisis will disrupt the global economy for many years ahead. After 15 days of fighting and heavy casualties, Israel eventually won the war, but the nation has revealed its vulnerabilities. Achieving peace is increasingly seen as essential. His primary opponent is open to the idea. On November 19, 1977, an unimaginable event occurred. Anwar el-Sadat, the president of Egypt, traveled to Jerusalem. No Arab leader had ever visited the Jewish state before. Yuri Hurwitz stood at the foot of the plane. Proudly Israeli, he was struck by the calm demeanor of the Egyptian president. Upon disembarking, he greeted everyone, shaking hands and offering hellos. Then he approached General Motagur. Sadat said to him, "You didn't expect me to come, did you? Here I am." We welcomed him warmly. Coming here took great courage, and he did it. A few years later, Sadat paid the ultimate price with his life. He was assassinated by a radical Islamist, but for now it's a victory celebrated in the Israeli parliament. Let's agree on one thing together. We must reach that point, face to face between us and you. We must continue so that even an old lady like me can live long enough to see the day when it's true that I've always said that. You always called me an old lady, Mr. President. With smiles all around, he's joking with former Prime Minister Golda Meir. Finally, Mr. President, from one grandmother to another, let me offer you this small gift for your new baby girl. And thank you for the gift you gave me. Meanwhile, 200 kilometers away in Lebanon, Yasser Arafat was rallying his forces. For his people, this visit brings unwelcome news. An Arab nation is striking a deal with the enemy, and the Palestinian cause is being sidelined. It was a tragic day for us all because it was the first time that someone broke our pact against Israel. Here we are, a people occupied by their forces, who expelled us by force, yet an Arab leader is negotiating with them, at our expense. A year later, Egypt and Israel signed the peace agreement at Camp David in the United States. In exchange, Israeli forces withdrew from Sinai, which they had occupied since the Six-Day War. For the first time, the Jewish state is at peace with one of its neighbors. In the refugee camps, nothing has changed. Here in Lebanon, we are now in the third generation. The Palestinians who arrived in 1948 had children and grandchildren without nationality. They are simply refugees. From birth they are taught they do not belong here, and that one day they will return to Palestine. The return jihad. They know everything about Jerusalem, about Palestinian history and its symbols. The refugees are supervised and trained by PLO forces, since being expelled from Jordan. Yasser Arafat has made Lebanon his new base. He has built up a formidable army that is intensifying attacks on northern Israel. Israel's response will come swiftly. In 1982, Israel launched an intervention in Lebanon, named Peace for Galilee. Yarov, now 11, is proud to see his older brother head to the front lines. I was proud that my brother was going to serve our country and protect it. He was leaving to help us survive. He was excited to go. When he returned, it was a different story. Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. Israeli forces are encircling the city. Operation Peace for Galilee has escalated into full-scale war. Initially, the troops were only meant to advance 40 kilometers to secure the border, but the Israeli commanders wanted to eliminate the PLO. They pushed all the way to Beirut. Weeks of intense street fighting, face-to-face battles among civilians on the capital streets. After 70 days of combat, the Palestinians were defeated. The fighters were evacuated from Beirut thanks to international mediation, especially by a French contingent. This time, Salah al-Tamari did not escape. He was taken prisoner. He was released a year later in a prisoner exchange with Israeli soldiers. As for Layla Khaled, she was among the evacuees on trucks heading for the port. She was pregnant and had just married. It was incredibly hard for us. In the truck heading to the port, I cried the entire journey, because I felt it was a new exile far from our homeland. After Jordan and Lebanon, the Palestinians once again found themselves on the road to exile. Yasser Arafat set sail for Tunisia with 4,000 fighters. Their families remained behind, and a new tragedy awaited them. Days after the fighters left, in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, hundreds of Palestinian women and children were massacred. a Christian militia, seeking revenge for the assassination of their leader, the new Lebanese president, carried out the slaughter. It was a bloodbath. The Israeli army was present. They allowed it to happen in Israel. 400,000 citizens outraged took to the streets. It was the largest demonstration in the country's history. Yarov joined the crowd with his parents. It was massive. There were so many people. The anger was palpable and there was a sense of shame. I think people wanted to show the world they were not responsible for this, and they opposed this military operation in Lebanon. The Israelis were shocked. They couldn't accept that their army might have made a mistake. They had seen themselves as victims. Now they found themselves the aggressors, and soon they would learn that rebellion was stirring on their doorstep. The Gaza Strip in 1987. Young Abdul Salam had become a computer scientist. He had just turned 26 and married his neighbor. Life in Gaza felt similar to that of Arab cities in Jordan or Egypt, with one difference. It had been under Israeli occupation since the Six-Day War 20 years prior. Israeli patrols were a daily sight. Abdul Salam could no longer tolerate them. We've lived in this camp for so long. We see the patrols constantly. It's like a wall between us and our life, between us and our freedom. These soldiers stand as a barrier to your hopes and dreams, and you can't leave. On December 8, 1987, everything changed. Local residents took to the streets throwing stones at Israeli soldiers. It all started with a simple car accident. This marked the beginning of the Intifada, an Arabic term meaning uprising. Abdul Salam had a camera. He filmed, and sometimes, like others, he threw stones. It was the first time people picked up stones to throw them. I did it too. I set down my camera and threw stones, at least 5 or 6. It had become clear. We had to throw stones. The explanation is simple. Is it to ask them, what are you doing here? Your language is different. You wear a uniform that is hard to accept. You're treating me badly. You shut the door. You shut the window. No more occupation. The message is very clear. Confronted by the stone throwers, Yitzhak Rabin, the victorious general of 1967, he is the defense minister. Like the others, Rabin is sent to school. He is convinced that it's a revolt with no future. He opts for firmness. He advises his soldiers to be more aggressive. He even specifically asks them to beat the stone throwers when caught in the act. Far from the action in Tel Aviv, Yarov Horowitz became a teenager. He is savoring his final moments of peace. At 18, like every Israeli citizen, he must complete his 3 years of military service. Amid the Intifada, he was dispatched to the occupied territories. As part of the army cinema, propaganda films are requested from him. One day, they sent me to the paratroopers to make a film to boost troop morale. They were near the end of their service. It was meant to remind them of their last days. It was supposed to be a cheerful and funny film. The interviews went in a different direction. Facing him, the soldiers confess. They say they were confused by this strange war, which turned them into bullies. They told me what they were doing, how frustrated they were chasing kids who threw stones at them without ever catching them. How they caught them now even before they threw the stones. We were walking down the street. We saw a group of 5 teens drinking tea and playing backgammon peacefully. We passed by, turned their table over and started hitting them. We knew that as soon as we passed, they would call us fags and Israeli bastards. They would throw stones at us, so we hit them first because then we wouldn't have had to catch them. When I showed the film to my superiors, they were shocked because no one imagined that. From our perspective, the Israeli army was the most moral of all. Morality was its foundation. We are Jewish. We survived the Holocaust. We must be very moral. When I returned, they discovered the reality. 18 to 19-year-olds, and I was also 19, who had completely lost their minds. Yarov's film was an electric shock that reached the highest levels of the state. The Israeli parliament forbids the same soldier from staying in occupied territory for more than 3 months, but every day of the Intifada, the rift between Arabs and Jews deepens a bit more. On September 13, 1993, in Washington at the White House, after 6 years of stone wars, there is finally immense hope. Yasser Arafat was taken by surprise by the Intifada. To avoid being overwhelmed, he must regain control. Opposite him, the new prime minister is Yitzhak Rabin. He understood his mistake. The Intifada is not a passing issue. They have to negotiate. Between them, there's Bill Clinton's America, which plays a decisive role. The first Gulf War in Iraq left its mark. Since 91, the Americans are convinced that this region must be pacified as soon as possible. Not everything is resolved, but peace is coming. After months of secret talks in Oslo, Norway, they are about to sign an agreement that grants Palestine autonomy. The Israelis agree to pull out their troops from Gaza and from the West Bank. In the long run, these territories could become a Palestinian state. The entire world is waiting for the event. The handshake between former enemies is not guaranteed. When I was watching TV, I saw the images of the bleeding. I saw the blood of the martyrs, those who had died in battle. When Arafat shook hands with Rabin, I hated it at that time. For us, when we see the image of Yasser Arafat, it is always accompanied by blood. When we see him shake hands with Rabin, we have very mixed feelings. I remember Arafat arriving to shake hands with Rabin. It was a huge question in Israel whether to shake hands with him, and the pause before Rabin extended his hand. He hesitates, then says to himself, let's do it, the time for peace has arrived. We will have fought you Palestinians, we are telling you today loud and clear, enough of blood and tears, enough. A few months later, thanks to the Oslo agreements, Yasser Arafat, the leader of the fighters, returns to Palestine for the first time. He makes a triumphant entry into Gaza. He will soon become the first president of the Palestinian Authority. Abdul Salam now has 4 children. He has become a cameraman for a news agency. It is the day he will never forget. Since childhood, I saw Arafat on TV. He was our champion, the very embodiment of our defiance. I had faith in that day when Arafat entered Gaza. I felt powerful emotions. I captured images of the faces of joyful people. We tell ourselves that peace is possible. At this moment, I'm very hopeful. Amidst the excitement of the talks, a few exiles are permitted to return. Salah al-Tamari, the leader of Karameh, for the first time since the 1967 war, he can return to his hometown of Bethlehem. Layla Khaled's situation is more complex. Israel refuses to welcome a former terrorist. She is granted a rare permission to visit the occupied territories for a few days. When I saw the Israeli flag, it was awful for me. It was the first thing I noticed when I crossed the border. I wanted to see my people. I went and they welcomed me. I never imagined something like this. It felt as though I knew everyone, though I knew no one. Layla Khaled travels to Gaza to attend the Palestinian National Congress. Abdul Salam is here. He's filming his interview. Are you going to Haifa? I don't think so. I'm not allowed to go there. When you see someone like Layla Khaled who hijacked a plane and we see her here, we think perhaps this is the beginning of peace. That the Israelis will make compromises, that the Palestinians will make compromises, that we are on the verge of a new era. But that's not what happened. On November 4, 1995, the square of the Kings of Israel in Tel Aviv is filled with people. The largest demonstration since Sabra and Shatila. It's a rally for peace. Side by side, the Israeli and Palestinian flags. At the podium, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin is moved. He didn't expect such a crowd. Since shaking hands with Arafat, some Israelis accuse him of treason. We won't just sing about peace, we will make it happen. Sing the peace song. These few words of the song will be his last. A few seconds later, he steps down from the podium. A Jewish extremist shoots him 3 times in the back. His supporters are shocked. To the world, Rabin symbolized hope. Even the American president struggles to hide his sorrow. Yitzhak Rabin was my partner and my friend. I admired him and genuinely liked him. Since words can't express my feelings, I'll simply say goodbye, my brother. Farewell, my friend. At the kibbutz of Kfar Giladi, the sorrow is overwhelming. Yuri Hurwitz, 68, was peacefully retiring when he heard the news. He knew the prime minister well. Rabin had visited the kibbutz several times to attend ceremonies. It was horrific. I don't know how to express my feelings about this savage animal who killed him. I was truly sick, not just me, all of Israel. We lost a leader. He was truly a great leader. Rabin's assassination is a severe blow to a peace process already in deep crisis. His successors don't always share the same convictions. Some, like Ariel Sharon, publicly declare that the Oslo Accords are the greatest disaster to ever strike Israel. Increasing numbers of Jewish settlers are moving into the occupied territories. They seek to make it impossible to establish a Palestinian state, and they openly state this. This is our land, it's not Palestine or the Palestinian state, it's Israel, it's the Holy Land of the Jews. I am Jewish, and we have the right to live in a Jewish state, and to remain wherever we choose. On the Palestinian side too, the peace process faces fierce opposition. Yasser Arafat is facing growing opposition. For some time now, Iran's radical Islam has been gaining strength across the Middle East. Arafat is overtaken by extremist religious factions that refuse to negotiate with Israel. The most prominent of these is Hamas. This party has become unavoidable by getting involved in social services and education. Gradually, fundamentalism takes root among Palestinians. I remember my sister who wore modern clothes, dresses, short skirts. Now all the women wear the same, dressed in black. Tensions rise on both sides. Everything is set for a new explosion. Autumn 2000, on the esplanade of the mosques in Jerusalem, a new intifada begins. This one is no longer a spontaneous uprising. It quickly escalates into a full-scale war. Guns replace stones. Street battles claim hundreds of lives. Suicide bombings become the new Palestinian weapon. Suicide bombers, claiming to be from Hamas or Islamic Jihad, detonate themselves in the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, each time the same scenes of panic and carnage. Yaroslav Horowitz, the young Israeli who filmed the Intifada, became a director. He lives in a fashionable neighborhood of Tel Aviv. He's afraid to leave the house. We were scared constantly. It happened twice a week, 3 times a week. We never knew there was an attack 2 minutes away. They were everywhere. It was disheartening. It's really disheartening. With each attack, Israel responds with violence. Entire neighborhoods are bombed in the occupied territories. When Israel launched a retaliatory operation in the Rafah camp, Abdul Salam is filming. He watches his childhood neighborhood vanish before his eyes. Here he is in an orange t-shirt with his camera. That day he narrowly avoids death. The Israelis destroyed everything. I couldn't even reach my neighborhood anymore. All my friends. My elementary school destroyed. School is awful. We have so many memories, but we can't find anything now. It feels as if my story is gone because someone came and destroyed my dream. That's what it was like in Rafah. I couldn't believe it. Yasser Arafat, the old Palestinian leader, is now a mere shadow. Hamas rejects his authority, and the Israelis no longer want to negotiate with him. He is ill. At the end of October 2004, he is flown to France for medical treatment. Al-Tamari, the commander of Karameh, remembers their last dinner. I dined with him a day before he left for Paris. It was Ramadan. I was alone sharing that meal with him. He was really very frail, and when he departed, I knew I would never see him again. Arafat never lacked bravery. He stayed true to his convictions. If our resistance movement has endured, it is because of him personally. He was someone who could make peace with the Israelis. With Arafat's death, the Palestinians lost their guide. Disillusioned with the peace process and with Fatah, they turned massively to Hamas, which won the elections. For Europe and America, Hamas in power is unacceptable, even after a democratic win. They cut off their aid to Palestine. The situation worsens. Fatah and Hamas are engaged in a civil war among Palestinians. The world's attention is mainly on Gaza. In 2005, Israel abandons the territory. The army withdraws from Gaza for the first time since 1967. Even the disgruntled Jewish settlers must depart. They are forced to leave their homes. Protecting them becomes too costly. Israel no longer wants Gaza. Palestinians celebrate the departure of the Hebrew soldiers. However, these images are deceiving. Because Israel retains control over all borders, and thus the region's economy. In 2007, after Hamas assumes power, Israel imposes a total blockade on the territory. The Gaza Strip is now a massive prison. Since then, each week, Hamas fires rockets into Israel, and Israel retaliates with airstrikes on Gaza. On December 27, 2008, Israel's planes bomb Gaza. After a 6-month truce, the conflict erupts again, more violent than ever. This time it's a large-scale operation, a new war. Israel aims to end the rocket fire once and for all along with Hamas. Hebrew tanks invade the Gaza Strip just like in 1967. In 60 years of violence, peace hasn't made much progress, just like this wall built by the Jewish state. A wall over 700 kilometers long that will soon wind around the entire West Bank, sometimes cutting through villages. A security barrier to protect against suicide attacks, say the Israelis. A wall of shame meant to make life unbearable, say the Palestinians. Today, Yuri Hurwitz is 82, the son of a pioneer who fought in every war. He still has the same confidence in his country. He remains loyal to his kibbutz in Kafir Giladi, no matter what happens. He plans to spend his final years there. Yaroslav Horowitz, now 37, is no longer the frightened Israeli who feared attacks. He's a renowned director in Tel Aviv. He returned to visit the soldiers he filmed during the Intifada. He made a movie about the upheaval of his generation. Salah al-Tamari is 65 years old. The Cairo student who became a commander in Karameh is now the governor of Bethlehem, the city where he was born, a city scarred by the wall. Abdul Salam Shahadiha has spent his 46 years in Gaza. The little boy who saw the tanks arrive in 1967 has become the head of a news agency. He lives cut off from the world due to the Israeli blockade.